I think March this year is going to be a very good month for movies. Every week this month there is something that I'm extremely excited for. The first week we had Logan, which I did love and am going to review very soon. The second week we had Kong Skull Island, which I loved and hopefully have a review for it up before this one's done. This week we have Beauty and the Beast. Next week we have Life, which could be another really great horror film because we've had some good ones so far this year. I know a lot of people are excited for Power Rangers. Heck, when I went to the Shack and we had a Power Rangers trailer before the Shack, there was one person in the movie theater that just went, woo! So I know there are definitely people excited for Power Rangers. I'm not particularly excited. I mean, the only week this month that feels iffy is the last week, which I'm still iffy about Ghost in the Shell. I'm iffy about Zookeeper's Wife, and I'm definitely not looking forward to Boss Baby whatsoever. So for me, that might be the only week this month that doesn't have a really great film. But enough about that. Let's actually get down to talking about Logan. So, Logan is the continuation of the Wolverine movies, which are a spin-off of the X-Men movies, as you'd expect. But Logan is very different from the other two Wolverine movies. This one's set in the near future, and it is a pretty damn grim future for mutants. In this film, the mutants, the X-Men, they're pretty much all dead and gone. The only ones around, it seems, is Logan, Wolverine, and Professor Xavier. There is one mutant from X-Men Apocalypse in this as well, who wasn't really an X-Men, or at least not in the movies. But most people that have seen X-Men Apocalypse probably do not remember him whatsoever. He had like one scene, or maybe two. At the beginning of this movie, Logan is going by a different name, barely scraping by as a limo driver, all while living with the other guy that was in X-Men Apocalypse, and they're them both trying to take care of Professor Xavier, whose mind is deteriorating. Yeah, some form of dementia, I'm thinking. But anyway, while this is going on, suddenly someone is asking for his help. He refuses, of course, but eventually he gets thrown into this mess, and now he has to bring this one girl to an apparent safe haven for mutants before some mercenaries and bad guys get a hold of her. And it turns out this little girl has the same exact mutant powers as Logan. And so it becomes a deadly road trip type of movie. First and foremost, from the trailers, I could tell that they were doing something different with this film, and I was hoping for something different. I was hoping for something very realistic, very gritty, something that tries to tell a much better story than we're used to in superhero films. And no, I do not have a problem with superhero films. I love a lot of superhero films, but something a little different now and then can go a really long way and become epic. And I was hoping Logan would be epic. And Logan is definitely epic, I feel. The acting all around is absolutely amazing. Let's face it, Hugh Jackman is the Wolverine. We cannot see the Wolverine without him being played by Hugh Jackman. He has been playing this character for so many years, and he just embodies Wolverine whenever he's on screen in these movies. He is probably more Wolverine in this movie than he has ever been in the other X-Men movies, which is definitely saying a lot because he is a damn near perfect Wolverine, I feel. Not only is he violent because it is a rated R film and he's more Wolverine than ever, he also plays an older version of Wolverine because he is slowly dying. He's actually aging in this film. And he has some very subtle character development throughout this film. Ones that if you've seen all the other films, if you've seen the type of character that Wolverine has become throughout the films, you can see there is character development and it doesn't spell it out for you. I mean, it's not one of those movies where it's like, hey, this person changed because of this. It's not like some character actually says it and states it. In fact, that's one of the things I loved about this movie is how subtle it is. Even though it has some really big action moments, all the character development, all the story that you get is through very smart lines of dialogue that tell you a lot, that have the audience have to figure it out for themselves, read between the lines, and you don't see that in a lot of big blockbuster movies. But back to the acting. Patrick Stewart, of course, is Professor X again. He's amazing in this role. Yes, he throws F-bombs in this movie. Yes, he's a little different. Well, that's because he's losing his mind. He has some form of dementia. Sometimes he's kooky, sometimes he's crazy, sometimes he's very loud and obnoxious. While throughout the movie you still get hints of old Patrick Stewart, of old Professor X throughout this movie as still being a wise character, still being a mentor, still being a father figure to Logan. These two actors have been playing this role for a long time, but it's heightened in this movie, especially since it's more about characters rather than plot or action. And speaking of those two characters, I do love how this movie handled them becoming older. Superheroes becoming older and the effects their powers have and what might happen. At the beginning of this film, he almost gets his limo stolen and he has to fight off these Mexican gang members. His fighting is sloppy, he looks like a drunk trying to fight them, but he still kills them in very brutal ways and shows that his old age is affecting his skills. Almost to the point where he's relying mostly on his healing powers than his actual fighting skills at the beginning of the film, even though his healing powers is failing him. Or maybe he's just become a little suicidal and doesn't mind if he dies. I love how the movie handled Professor Xavier's dementia and how this would affect a very powerful psychic. You want to know how a very deteriorated mind affects a very powerful psychic? Well, he's now classified as a weapon of mass destruction. Because when he has seizures, it freezes everyone, and they could die if they stay in that frozen state. And the young actress playing Laura in this film is downright amazing. Daphne Keane, I hope that's how you pronounce her name. She was fantastic in this movie and had a very animalistic ferocity to her. She is definitely a young female Wolverine in this movie. Her facial expressions, there's something in her brow that made her very animalistic and very vicious in the fights. Heck, even later towards the film where you almost see a bunch of other refugee kids, other refugee mutant kids that almost feel like a young X-Men group. Even when she's among them, she feels like the outsider. She feels like she's the Wolverine character to these young kids. That's as much as I'm going to go into without spoiling anything at the end. But like I said, she's amazing, and she still has that, despite that ferocity, she still has that childlike innocence to her from time to time, which leads to some of the most ironic and some of the most dark and comedic moments in the film. Like, for instance, after this huge battle where she kills a bunch of people and they're running away and they stop at a convenience store, it's right before the scene that they show in the trailer where she almost kills a guy over some stolen chips and sunglasses. She sees one of those kid rides that you put a quarter in and it's like a horse or a rocket or something along those lines that kids rock in to keep them distracted. Well, she goes into one of those things and you forget that despite her viciousness and how she kills people, she still is a kid and she wants to play and do things like that. The only problem is when this kid gets angry, she's a lethal weapon. Which makes sense because she was sort of designed to be a weapon in this movie. Which, like I said, it leads to some really dark comedic moments, but at the same time you really feel for her and these other kids that were designed to be weapons, and there's something really deep about that storyline that really affected me. And I definitely like the actors that played the villains in this movie. The head honcho villain, the scientist that's doing creepy experiments, is probably the most comic book villain in the entire film. Probably the most bland and stereotypical villain. But it's done in a realistic manner, and the actor, did a good job with that character. Now, the head of the mercenaries, he was a really fun comic book character. He was the kind of comic book character that is sarcastic, is kind of lighthearted, but in a way that made him more sinister because of how unfeeling and how intimidating he could be at the same time. Like, he can have this fanboy man crush about Wolverine, but still have no problem killing kids or trying to kill Wolverine. Now, ultimately, I do love the fact that this movie is rated R because it is something that a Wolverine movie probably needed to be. And we do have Deadpool to thank about that, but Deadpool is rated R for very different reasons than Logan. Unlike Deadpool, which is a funny movie, an immature movie, satirical movie, it's rated R for the cursing and the sexual content and all that stuff. This one is more of a realistic, gritty, bloody, violent film. And if you hate that about the film because it's rated R, because superheroes curse and people die, I mean, should you realize the rating is rated R? I mean, it's rated R. Don't bring your kids to a rated R film without finding out what it's rated for. Don't think, oh, it's a superhero film, so it's a family-friendly film. I mean, honestly, I would probably if I had kids, I would take my kids to it because it introduces them to some pretty serious themes and serious messages that I think kids could still understand, or at least teenagers and preteens. But there's definitely some younger audiences that will be frightened by this film, and those are the kind of kids that shouldn't really be in the theater. Unlike a lot of superhero films, this is more of a character-driven story than a plot-driven story. And yes, there are some other superhero films that I will consider character-driven films. And some of them are very character-driven and very plot-driven. But this is one of the few that is just character-driven. And I have to say, this is what I loved about the film. This is what made it a great film rather than just a really good film. If you want to see more action, then you kind of came to the wrong film. If you didn't realize by the trailer that it was going to be a deeper movie and more realistic film, and definitely a rated R film, then I don't know what you saw in the trailer that everyone else seemed to have seen. And if you want your hand held throughout this film, if you want everything to be explained to you in a nice and tidy manner, this is not the film for you either, because it is subtle in its storytelling. Because there is a lot of backstory in this film that isn't quite told specifically to you. Like if you think about, oh, what happened to the X-Men? How did they die? What happened to these characters? Why is Wolverine dying? I think all of this is definitely within the film. All the answers are in the film. You just gotta read between the lines of the dialogue and think about the double meanings of some of these dialogue moments. Because never once did I feel like there were plot holes in the film. Never once did I feel like, oh, I'm confused, I don't know what's happening. It's all explained, just not explained directly. There are definitely fewer action sequences in this movie, but when there is an action sequence, it is brutal, it is intense, and it is amazing. From the last fight to one of the first fights that we see a little bit of in the trailer. And let me just say, this movie is definitely not afraid to kill off major characters. I won't say who, but it's not afraid. Let's just say that. And while some of these moments I saw coming, there's a lot of moments in this film where I saw coming, could predict, but it really was still very effective and didn't harm my view of the film. It definitely takes some superhero cliches and moments that you expect in superhero movies, but twist them in a more realistic fashion. And I feel the last shot of this movie is a perfect send-off for this film. I think some people can find it cheesy, and I would understand that, but it feels very poetic. Yes, poetic, something I didn't expect to say about a Wolverine movie. There's a lot of other amazing moments in this film that I don't want to get too much into, because I don't want to spoil it if you haven't seen the film, but most likely you've already seen the film. You already decided if you want to see it or not. I mean, this is... probably everyone saw it the first week it came out, like I did. Just took a while to actually get the time to start doing some of these movie reviews. But one thing I do have to say about it, one flaw that I noticed, and this is, I know this is probably nitpicky, but it was things that I felt were really bad. It's the CGI. Okay, blood is great. The claws, all that stuff, really great. Stunt work, really great. The visual effects that I'm talking about, the things that looked cartoony, was everything else in the digital stuff. Like there's this fence that they have to go through that looks pretty bad looking, or at least cartoony looking. And there is this green screen effect during one of the car rides. I believe, I'm trying to think where this car ride was. I think it was right after the Vegas scene, so that I can give you a hint on what to look for or what to try to remember. Yeah, I think it was definitely after the Vegas scene, because I think it was the car ride right before they almost get run off the road. Because I think I remember cornfields in the background, and that would make sense if it was that scene. But anyway, in that car ride when three of them were having some back and forth and talking, and the camera changes to each of their faces so that we get more of a close-up of while they're talking. You know how it edits to different camera views because of that, so we can see who's talking and all that, have a close-up of all of them. All I can think about in that scene, other than the dialogue and how everything else in it was amazing, was the really horrible green screen effect as we're seeing the car pass by cornfields. It was something about the lighting or the outlines or something that certain shots during that scene looked absolutely dreadful, almost the Shack level green screen, while other moments looked completely fine within that scene, which is really weird. Other than that, I love this movie. It does fit the franchise. I mean, it is definitely part of the X-Men franchise, but then again, the X-Men franchise, the tone of each movie has been so radically different here and there that is really a strange franchise to think about. I know some people feel it's way too different from all the other films, but honestly, a lot of other films in this franchise are very different from all the other ones. Now, the score I'm about to give Logan isn't the real score of this film. Because of how I do scores now, I look at a more critical score, and that's an average of about 9 or 10 different scores, because I score or different levels of the film techniques such as story, characters, editing, visual effects. I score each of those things out of 5, do an average, and that's the critical score. Then I have my personal score, add these together, divide it by 2, get the average obviously, and that's the real score. But when I actually film these movie reviews, I round to the nearest half or whole star, because saying something like 4.87 is really weird to do for a movie review, I feel. Which ultimately is technically this real score for the movie, 4.87. So ultimately I do have to round, and it does round up to 5 stars. My cutoff point isn't going to be exactly 4.76, which normally would make it round up to 5. I'm going to be a little bit more critical on that, and so there is going to be a much higher cutoff point when I round to 5. Logan did meet that cutoff point, so it does round up to 5. Just know that because of some pretty bad green screen, the critical score went down a little bit, and the actual score is 4.87 or something like that. But for the sake of this movie review, I did round it up to 5 stars. So, did you see Logan? What did you think about it? Go ahead and comment below. If you haven't seen Logan, well, what are you waiting for? But other question, what is your favorite X-Men film in this franchise? It could be any of the X-Men films. It could be any of the spin-off Wolverine films. I don't know if we should include Deadpool, because I think it's its own franchise. I mean, it's done by the same company. I don't think it's technically an X-Men franchise film. Though it isn't afraid to have X-Men characters in it, I feel it's still its own thing. And if you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and check out my movie reviews of 2015, 2016, or 2017. As always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.